I live in Houston, Texas, in a house most people would call a mansion. Our home sits in the woodlands, a master-planned community lined with towering pines and quiet lakes that reflect the glow of the evening lights. On paper, my life looks enviable. Married to Mark, the director of sales for one of the state's largest oil companies, with 2 children who have already stepped into their own successful lives. Sophie, my daughter, is 26 now, working in healthcare administration in Dallas. Ethan, 2 years younger, chose technology and quickly made a name for himself at a software firm in Austin. I often look at them and feel that rare kind of pride only a mother can carry. The deep satisfaction that everything you sacrificed was worth it. But that pride carries its own shadow, because when I trace back the journey that brought us here, I can't forget how different things once were. Mark and I started with almost nothing. In the early years of our marriage, we lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment just outside downtown. The kitchen sink leaked constantly, the old radiator clanged through winter nights, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear the neighbor's television like it was in our own living room. We couldn't afford more, but we were happy in a way that felt unshakable. We studied late into the night together. Mark worked shifts at a gas station to cover tuition, while I took on part-time work at a grocery store. I stretched every dollar, cooking simple meals, reusing clothes, and doing whatever it took to make sure he could finish his degree. I remember the way he used to look at me back then, with gratitude, with determination. He'd say, "We'll get out of this, Linda. I'll make sure you never have to worry again." And I believed him with every part of my heart. Slowly, his promise became reality. Mark graduated, then secured his first corporate job. Raises followed, promotions came, and with each step forward, our lives shifted. We traded the apartment for a small house, then eventually for the grand property in the woodlands. The garage filled with luxury cars, vacations became annual traditions, and the worry about bills faded. For years, I told myself this was the reward for the sacrifices we both had made. I stepped back from full-time work after the children were born, teaching part-time around their schedules. Instead, I poured myself into raising Sophie and Ethan, into keeping our household not just running, but thriving. I attended every school function, stayed up with them when they were sick, helped with homework, and made sure they grew up surrounded by stability. I wore the badge of a full-time mother and wife proudly, even when others looked at me as though I had chosen the lesser path. I knew in my heart that without my dedication, none of this, the mansion, the security, the perfect family image, would have been possible. For a long time, I believed I had built a perfect marriage too. Mark and I had been through so much together, and we had created a life that outsiders admired. At parties, friends would tell me how lucky I was, how strong we seemed as a couple. I smiled because, from the outside, everything did look flawless. But perfection has a way of cracking quietly. Over the past few years, I began to notice the small shifts, tiny fractures that most would overlook. Mark became quieter at home, less interested in conversation. The man who once told me every detail of his day now kept his stories for colleagues or business partners. At the dinner table, he was often distracted, scrolling through his phone, nodding absently when I spoke. Our evenings, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, grew silent. At first, I brushed it off as stress. His job was demanding, the oil market unpredictable, and I told myself he simply needed space. But the truth was harder to ignore. The warmth that had carried us through our hardest years was cooling, replaced by something that felt more like formality than affection. It was as if we had become business partners in running a household rather than husband and wife bound by love. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself. I clung to the image of us that others admired, the story I had told myself for decades, that we had survived the worst together, so nothing could break us now. Yet deep inside, I knew those small cracks were real and they were spreading. What once felt unshakable no longer felt certain. I used to believe love was a fragile thing, something that could break without warning. That belief came from my first heartbreak, the kind of wound that shapes the way you look at every man who comes after. Back in high school, I was in love with Robert Evans, the boy everyone admired. He was handsome, confident, the kind of guy who could light up a room just by walking in. I thought he was my forever, until one afternoon I saw him holding hands with another girl, laughing as if I never existed. I confronted him, hoping it was a misunderstanding, but his casual shrug and the coldness in his eyes crushed me. "It's not serious with you," he said. That was the day something inside me broke. After that, I carried a wall around my heart. I smiled. I went to class. I laughed with my friends. But deep down, I told myself never to trust a man with my whole heart again. Mark was there in those years, though at the time I barely noticed. He wasn't the loud one in the cafeteria or the star of the football team. He was the boy in the back row, quiet, awkward, always carrying more books than anyone else. Looking back, I realized he had always been there, in the background of my life, watching with an earnestness I was too blind to see. Years passed, and I moved on to college, determined to rebuild myself. That's when fate intervened. One evening, my roommate dragged me to a performance at a local theater in downtown Houston. I remember the buzz of the crowd, the velvet seats, the smell of dust and old wood mingled with perfume. I wasn't expecting anything life-changing, just a night to distract myself. But when I turned to the row behind me, I saw him, Mark. Older now, taller, still carrying that same shy smile. After the show, he approached me with a hesitation that was almost endearing. "Linda," he said softly, as if saying my name was something sacred. We talked for hours that night, first about trivial things, professors, classes, mutual friends. But as the night wore on, the conversation deepened. His voice shook a little when he finally confessed, "I've been in love with you since 6th grade. I never had the courage to tell you." I was stunned. It felt surreal, hearing those words from someone I had always overlooked. But there was no arrogance in his confession, no expectation. Just truth, raw and simple. And for the first time since Robert shattered me, I felt something stir inside, a flicker of safety. We started seeing each other, slowly at first. Mark was nothing like Robert. He didn't sweep me off my feet with grand gestures or sweet lines whispered under the bleachers. He was steady, patient. Our first date wasn't dinner at a fancy restaurant. It was coffee in a small diner near campus. Our first kiss wasn't fireworks and drama. It was quiet, gentle, in the parking lot after he walked me home. But in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: trust. I remember the first time he hugged me. It wasn't just an embrace, it was an anchor. I buried my face against his chest and realized that for once, I didn't feel the urge to keep a part of myself hidden. He didn't try to fix me or pretend I wasn't broken. He just held me, as if to say, "I see you and it's enough." That was the turning point. Love didn't have to be fragile, not with Mark. With him, it was sturdy, built on patience and sincerity. One step at a time, he helped me believe again. Eventually, that belief grew into a marriage, into a family. Sophie and Ethan came along, and our lives became a whirlwind of diapers, bedtime stories, school recitals, and laughter that filled every corner of our modest little apartment back then. When I look back now, it's that foundation, those simple moments of honesty and gentleness, that carried us through the hardest years. Our love wasn't born out of drama or passion that burns out. It was built brick by brick, a fortress that I thought nothing could tear down. But sometimes, even the strongest walls can begin to crack. The early years of our marriage were nothing like the life we live now. Our small duplex on the outskirts of Houston was cramped, its walls thin enough that I could hear the neighbors argue through the night. Money was always tight, and sometimes I'd sit at the kitchen table with a pile of bills in front of me, trying to stretch a single paycheck across groceries, utilities, and diapers. Still, I remember those days with a certain tenderness, because despite the struggle, we had each other, and somehow that made the burden lighter. Mark threw himself into work with a relentlessness I both admired and resented. He would leave before sunrise, his tie hastily knotted, coffee in hand, and return long after the children were asleep. Sophie was barely 3 when Ethan was born, and I found myself juggling a toddler on one hip and an infant on the other, while lesson plans for my students lay half-finished on the dining table. Teaching was never a lucrative career, but it gave me a sense of purpose beyond diapers and dishes. I would stand in front of my classroom, chalk dust on my hands, and remind myself that I was still Linda, the woman with her own voice and mind, even as the demands of family pulled at me from every side. Those years were exhausting, yet they were also the years when I felt most needed. I would watch Sophie's curls bounce as she ran across the living room, or hold Ethan's tiny hand as he slept, and I'd feel a quiet pride in knowing I was the one holding our family together. Mark would come home late, weary and distracted, but when he did smile, when he bent down to kiss the children goodnight, it was as though the long hours were worth it. We told ourselves it was temporary, that all the sacrifices would one day build a better life for Sophie and Ethan. As the years passed, the sacrifices began to bear fruit. Mark's dedication at the oil company earned him promotion after promotion. He went from a junior sales rep scrambling to meet quotas to a respected manager with a team under him. With each step forward, our life changed. First, it was a used car that actually ran without breaking down every other month. Then, it was moving from our duplex to a modest single-family home, closer to the city. Eventually, after more than a decade of grinding effort, Mark accepted a director position. That promotion opened doors we never imagined when we were eating ramen noodles on a Tuesday night. I remember the day we moved into our house in the Woodlands. Sophie was heading off to college in Washington, and Ethan was preparing applications of his own. I stood in the foyer of that sprawling house, marble floors shining beneath my feet, and thought back to the peeling linoleum of our first kitchen. It felt surreal. We had climbed a mountain together, step by painstaking step. And yet, in that moment of triumph, there was a strange hollowness. The children were grown, their lives expanding far beyond our reach, and Mark was more absent than ever. His success came with endless business trips, late-night conference calls, and dinners with clients I never met. Our home was grand, but it often echoed with silence. I told myself that this was the season of life, that marriages evolved, and that love sometimes looked like two people faithfully carrying their responsibilities, even if their paths didn't always cross. But deep inside, I missed the younger version of us, the nights when we laughed over cheap takeout, the mornings when he would squeeze my hand as though we were in this fight together. Still, to the outside world, our life looked perfect. A beautiful home, accomplished children, a husband whose name carried weight in the oil industry. And me, the devoted wife who had held it all together. Neighbors admired us. Friends envied us. And I smiled because that's what was expected. Only I knew that perfection can be deceiving, that beneath the polished surface, small cracks had already begun to form. I used to believe that nothing could shake the foundation of the life Mark and I had built. After years of sacrifice and devotion, I thought we had entered the season of peace, where love matures into companionship and loyalty grows deeper with time. But I was wrong. The cracks began quietly, almost invisible at first. Mark stopped asking about my day. He no longer listened when I told him stories from school. Funny little things my students said, the challenges of preparing them for exams. He used to smile, encourage me, sometimes even help me grade papers late at night. Now his eyes drifted toward his phone, his laptop, anywhere but me. I brushed it off at first. I told myself he was tired, overworked, climbing the corporate ladder. I cooked his favorite meals. I tried to keep the house warm and welcoming, but the distance only grew. Then came the comments, sharp, careless words that pierced deeper than he realized. Linda, you've let yourself go. You're always tired. You don't look like you used to. At first I laughed, pretending it was nothing, but each remark chipped away at me. I stood in front of the mirror at night, tracing the faint lines around my eyes, the weariness in my shoulders from years of teaching and mothering. I saw the woman who had given everything to her family, yet somehow was now invisible. That was when Chloe Carter appeared. She was young, vibrant, with hair that shone under the office lights, laughter that rang too easily. Mark mentioned her once, a new assistant, very capable. Then suddenly I heard her name too often. A slip of the tongue, a story retold, a smile he didn't know he was giving away. I tried not to think the worst. For weeks I lived in denial. But then Valerie Parker, my closest friend since college, pulled me aside one afternoon. Her face was pale, her voice low. "Linda, I don't know how to tell you this, but I've seen Mark's car more than once, parked outside an apartment building on Jefferson Street, always at night." The ground shifted beneath me. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream at her, to deny it, to call her a liar. But Valerie's eyes held sorrow, not malice. She loved me too much to invent something like this. That night, I sat alone in the living room after everyone had gone to bed. The silence pressed in, and the truth began to unravel inside me. Every cold glance, every cruel word, every unexplained late night at the office, it all aligned too perfectly. Chloe wasn't just a name anymore. She was the shadow in my marriage, the third presence at our table, the ghost in my bed. Tears blurred my vision, but beneath the grief, something else stirred. A deep, simmering anger I had never known before. After all the years I gave him, my youth, my trust, my body that bore his children, Mark chose to betray me for a fleeting thrill. I clenched my hands until my nails dug into my skin. I whispered into the darkness, not to anyone in particular, but to myself. If this is true, he has no idea what I'm capable of. That Friday afternoon, the autumn air felt heavier than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I followed Mark's car down the familiar streets of Houston. For days, I had tried to push away Valerie's words, her gentle but hesitant warning that she had seen Mark's car parked near a downtown apartment building far too often. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Business, late meetings, client visits. But deep down, something inside me had already known the truth. And today, I needed to see it with my own eyes. When Mark's car finally slowed and turned into a shaded driveway, my heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the sound of my own breathing. I parked a short distance away, hidden behind a row of trees, my fingers trembling as I clutched my phone. Then I saw her, Chloe Carter, young, graceful, walking out of the lobby with a smile that felt rehearsed, yet intoxicating. She moved toward him with a confidence that told me this wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake. Mark stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie in that same casual, careless way he used to do before kissing me goodnight. But instead of coming home to me, he walked straight into her arms. I froze as Chloe leaned in, pressing her lips against his. He didn't resist. He welcomed it. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I felt my knees weaken as though the earth beneath me had collapsed. They laughed softly together before disappearing inside the apartment building, his hand resting comfortably on the small of her back. That single gesture shattered everything. I couldn't breathe. My chest ached, but not with sorrow, at least not only sorrow. Something else, something darker and sharper, stirred within me. Suddenly, I was no longer standing in Houston, watching my husband betray me. I was back in the past, a young woman with trembling hands, opening the door to Robert's apartment and seeing him with someone else. That memory, once a scar, I thought had healed, ripped open again with terrifying clarity. The taste of betrayal was bitterly familiar, and I realized with crushing certainty that history was repeating itself. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not this time. I had cried enough for Robert. I had begged, pleaded, and torn myself apart trying to understand what I had done wrong. But standing there in the shadows, watching Mark vanish into another woman's home, I understood something with icy clarity. This was not my fault. I had given him my youth, my loyalty, my sleepless nights nursing our children while he chased promotions. I had given him a home filled with warmth, laughter, and stability. If he chose to throw that away for the glitter of something new and shallow, that was his sin to bear, not mine. The sorrow inside me hardened into rage. My hands no longer trembled. They clenched into fists. The fire that had flickered faintly within me for years now roared to life, devouring the last remnants of weakness. I was no longer the naive girl Robert had destroyed. I was Linda Whitaker, a woman who had built an entire life from ashes once before. And if Mark thought he could break me, he was gravely mistaken. I sat there in my car, staring at the closed door of the apartment, letting the betrayal etch itself deep into my memory. I wanted to remember this moment, the image of him holding Chloe, the sound of their laughter, as fuel. Fuel for what would come next. Because this time, I wasn't going to crumble. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to be silent. No, I would rise, and I would make sure Mark regretted every second he had underestimated me. And as I drove away, the tears finally came, not tears of weakness, but tears of fury. They slid down my face like molten fire, and I whispered to myself, steady and resolute, "This ends on my terms." I didn't sleep for days after seeing Mark with Chloe. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of them together replayed, like a cruel film. I knew I couldn't just rely on whispers and suspicions. If I wanted to confront him, not in a screaming match that would end with me shattered on the floor, but in a way that would burn itself into his memory forever, I needed proof. That's when I called Frank Delgado. He was an old-school, private investigator in Houston, the kind of man who could blend into a crowd without anyone noticing. His office smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper files, and when he looked at me across his desk, I think he saw the same thing Robert's betrayal had left in me years ago, a woman tired of being broken. I need everything, I told him, my voice firmer than I felt. Photos, receipts, anything that ties Mark to her. I don't care how ugly it is. I need the truth, all of it. Frank didn't ask questions. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope slid across my kitchen table. My hands shook as I opened it. There it was, Mark and Chloe, hand in hand at a hotel in Seattle. Boarding passes with both their names, flying out for a business trip he had sworn was all meetings. Restaurant receipts, champagne bills, late-night charges from the same apartment building Valerie had mentioned. And the photographs. The photographs told a story I could never unsee. Mark's arm wrapped around her waist, his lips pressed to her neck. Chloe smiling in a way she had never smiled at me. I sat there for hours, the papers spread out around me like a crime scene. At first, I thought about going for the obvious revenge, printing the pictures, sliding them into an envelope, and delivering them to the partners at his firm. Imagine the boardroom gasps, the way his reputation would crumble in an instant. For a moment, I savored it, but then reality hit me. Sophie and Ethan, our children, they would be the ones to carry the shame of having their fathers' sins plastered across whispers and gossip. I pressed my palms into the table, breathing hard. No, that wasn't the way. I wasn't going to scorch the earth around him just to feel better for a few minutes. Revenge, if it was going to mean anything, had to be larger, smarter, something that would cut him exactly where it hurt most, in a place he could never recover from. And that place was our house. That mansion wasn't just walls and a roof. It was Mark's pride, the gleaming trophy of his success. He had walked me through every remodel, every imported tile, every chandelier, as if it was proof he had made it. He loved that house more than he loved anything else, maybe even more than us. And suddenly I knew, if I could take that away, if I could make him watch it slip through his fingers, that would be justice. The idea started as a flicker and grew into a fire. What if I staged a sale? What if, on paper, the house no longer belonged to him? A legal trick, a sleight of hand he would never see coming. He would think he was losing the crown jewel of his life, and by the time he realized what I had done, it would already be too late. I called my cousin Cassandra, Cass as everyone called her. She was sharp, savvy, the kind of woman who could charm her way through any negotiation. I laid it out for her in hushed tones over coffee. The fake sale, the transfer of documents, the appearance that the house was gone. Cass's eyes widened, then narrowed with something like admiration. "You really want to do this?" she asked, almost smiling. I looked down at the pile of photographs still sitting in my bag. My chest ached, but the fire in my veins kept me steady. "I don't just want to," I said quietly. "I need to." That night, as the house creaked softly around me, I traced the marble countertops with my fingers. Mark thought this was his kingdom. Soon he would learn it was never his at all. It was mine, and I was about to take it back in the only way he would never forget. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, memories of Cass drifted back to me like fragments of an old film reel. Years ago, when her world was collapsing under the fists and cruelty of her husband, it was me who drove 2 hours in the middle of the night to pull her and her children out of that house. I can still remember the way her hands shook as she clutched her little girl's blanket, the way her eyes flickered with both fear and determination. That night, I promised her she would never be alone again. Now, when I reached out to her, I didn't have to explain much. Cass simply listened in silence, then said the words that made my chest tighten with gratitude. "Linda, after what you did for me, I'll do whatever you need. Tell me how to help." With her support secured, I began laying the groundwork. The plan had to be flawless. One mistake, and Mark would see right through it. I spent days quietly collecting every piece of paper, every draft, every legal reference I could find to craft a contract that looked legitimate, indistinguishable from the real thing. Cass connected me with a friend, an attorney who owed her a favor, who quietly tweaked the language to make the sale look official, though the terms would ensure I could reclaim the property later. For weeks, I rehearsed how it would unfold. Timing would be everything. I needed a moment when Mark's guard was down, when his arrogance and carelessness would blind him. And then the night presented itself. He stumbled in well past midnight, the scent of whiskey heavy on his breath, his tie hanging loose around his neck. His eyes were glassy, his movements sluggish, but his mouth still curled into that same smug grin that once charmed me and now only repulsed me. He tossed his keys on the counter, barely noticing me sitting at the table with a neat stack of papers. "What's this?" he slurred, his voice thick. I kept my tone calm, steady, almost disinterested. "Just some refinancing paperwork. With the market right now, it's the perfect time. We could save a lot of money, Mark." He groaned, rubbing his temples. "You and your money-saving schemes. Fine, where do I sign?" I slid the papers toward him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might echo through the room. My palms were slick with sweat, but my expression betrayed nothing. I placed the pen in his hand, steadying it just enough so the signature came out clean. He didn't even read the words. Of course he didn't. Mark had always assumed I existed to manage the details, to tidy up the loose ends of his life. With a careless flick of his wrist, he scrawled his name on the final page. The moment the ink met paper, a current of triumph surged through me. My entire body trembled with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. He had no idea what he had just done. No idea that in one drunken moment of arrogance, he had handed me the weapon I needed to dismantle him. He shoved the papers back across the table and staggered toward the bedroom, muttering something about an early meeting. I sat frozen, staring at his signature as though it were glowing, a sacred mark on the page. The air in the room shifted. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I gathered the documents carefully, sliding them into the envelope Cass had prepared. My fingers lingered on the paper, savoring the quiet power that pulsed through me. This was my first real victory. Small, yes, but it was the foundation of everything that would follow. That night, lying awake in the silence of our vast, empty house, I no longer felt powerless. The walls that had once echoed with Mark's contempt now seemed to hum with a different energy mine. I had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. That morning, as sunlight streamed through the tall windows of our kitchen, Mark seemed unusually cheerful. He hummed while sipping his espresso, his crisp white shirt smelling faintly of expensive cologne. I knew exactly why. He thought he was still in control, still the husband pulling the strings. He leaned against the counter, flashing me a rehearsed smile. "Linda, I've been planning something special for us. Tonight, on our anniversary, I'll surprise you. Just you wait." His tone was smooth, almost smug. I nodded politely, suppressing the bitter laugh bubbling inside me. He had no idea that my surprise would eclipse his in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. All day, I moved through the house with steady purpose. The air was heavy with anticipation, yet my hands never trembled. In the guest room, I packed a leather suitcase with Mark's clothes, folding them as if I were preparing for a trip. But this wasn't a vacation, this was exile. On top of the neatly folded shirts and ties, I placed a manila envelope filled with the photographs Detective Delgado had given me. Mark, wrapped around another woman in airports, hotels, bars. Proof undeniable. Proof he could never spin. Then I carried the suitcase downstairs and set it in the center of the living room, right under the chandelier. A stage had been set. By evening, the house was quiet, candles lit across the dining room table. I wore a simple black dress, not to impress, but to armor myself. Mark arrived later than promised, the front door creaking open as his laughter filled the foyer. He carried a bouquet of lilies and a glossy envelope. "Happy anniversary, darling," he said, stepping forward with his theatrics. He handed me the envelope first. Inside was a set of travel documents. A week in Paris. 5-star hotel. Just us. A fresh start. His voice faltered slightly, as if he was trying too hard to believe in his own performance. I didn't reach for the bouquet. Instead, I gestured toward the living room. "Sit down, Mark. We need to talk." He frowned, sensing the change in air. His eyes flickered to the suitcase. "What's this?" he asked, his voice low, defensive. I remained calm, almost detached. From the coffee table, I lifted the stack of enlarged photos and dropped them into his lap. They spilled across his knees like shards of broken glass. Mark's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. "You thought I didn't know," I said quietly. "But I knew everything. Every trip. Every lie." He reached for the papers with trembling hands, searching for an explanation. But I cut him off with the final blow. From the side drawer, I pulled out a crisp document, stamped and notarized the divorce petition. "Already filed," I said firmly. "And the house? Signed over. It's mine now, not yours." His eyes widened as he stared at the legal language. His own signature at the bottom of the deed. I could almost see the exact moment realization struck. That drunken night, when he had scribbled his name without reading, had sealed his downfall. The silence stretched heavy. He tried to stand, tried to protest, but I held up my hand. "Don't," I warned. "Everything you love, the house, your reputation, your comfort, it's gone. You gave it to me." My voice didn't rise. I didn't need to scream. Power doesn't need volume. For the first time since I had met him, Mark looked small, fragile, cornered. He sank back into the couch, clutching the papers like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. The bouquet slid from his fingers, petals scattering across the rug. "Linda, please," he whispered, his bravado stripped bare. But I felt no pity. Not anymore. I stood tall, the glow of the chandelier casting my shadow over him. "This is the end, Mark. Pack what's left of your pride into that suitcase. Leave this house tonight, because tomorrow it won't be yours to walk into." And in that moment, watching his empire crumble, watching him realize he had been outplayed, I felt something I hadn't in years. Freedom. When the storm finally passed, the silence that followed was almost surreal. Mark tried, for a short while, to cling to me as if his apologies and half-hearted promises could rewind everything he had broken. But his words carried no weight anymore. I had already stepped beyond the threshold of pain. I was no longer the woman who once wept behind closed doors. The final blow did not even come for me. Chloe, the woman he had risked everything for, the one he thought would always stand by him, walked away the moment she realized his fortune and his house no longer belonged to him. I remember seeing her car pull away without so much as a goodbye. Mark stood there like a man stripped of armor, abandoned by the very person he had gambled our marriage on. In that moment, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. For me, however, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about freedom. Signing those papers, securing the house in my name, and watching Chloe vanish from his side. It all felt like chains falling off. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the woman who chose herself, who stopped begging to be seen and started reclaiming her life. There were days in the quiet aftermath when I'd walk through the house and hear echoes of the past, our laughter in the kitchen when things were still good, his footsteps late at night, the arguments that never seemed to end. But instead of hurting me, those memories only reminded me how far I had come. The walls that once felt like a prison now stood as a fortress, protecting my independence, my dignity, and my peace. Standing in front of the mirror one morning, I barely recognized myself. My eyes no longer carried the dullness of exhaustion. My shoulders no longer slumped under invisible weight. I could finally breathe without fear of the next betrayal. Empowerment wasn't a sudden wave crashing down. It was a steady rise, a tide lifting me higher each day. People often believe that leaving a marriage means failure. I used to believe that too. But now I know the truth. The real failure is losing yourself in the process of trying to hold on to something that's already gone. Mark taught me that lesson in the harshest way possible. And though the scars remain, they are reminders of my strength, not my weakness. As I signed the last document finalizing our divorce, I felt no hatred, no anger, only clarity. Mark was no longer my husband, and that was not a tragedy, it was my rebirth. Chloe's departure was merely proof that those who build love on lies will never stay when the lies crumble. The night everything ended, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the large window overlooking the garden. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for the first time in years, I felt a profound stillness. No tears, no pleading thoughts, no questions left unanswered. Just me, standing tall in the very house he had once tried to take from me, the house that now symbolized my victory. And I realized something I wished I had known long ago. Happiness doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself. Love, no matter how intoxicating, should never cost you your dignity. Marriage, no matter how sacred, should never demand your silence in the face of betrayal. As I closed the curtains and turned off the lights, I whispered to myself, not in sorrow but in triumph, I am enough. I always was. And in that truth, I finally found peace.